Hello and welcome to Syria Talks, the unique show exploring the intricacies of the Syria crisis. I'm your host, Danny Mackey. For the previous month, the crisis in Syria has helped give birth to the most dangerous terror movement in modern history. The Islamic State, as it is now known, is the richest and most ruthless terror group in the world. The rate of its development, the lethality of its armory, and the brutality of its actions have sent shockwaves around the international community. Whilst the coalition against ISIS is fighting a slightly paralysed war, groups on the ground ranging from the Peshmerga, the YPG, to the Syrian army have registered victories against this death cult. Most notably the victory in Kobani and the ISIS failing to capture at large cost Deir ez-Zor military airport from the Syrian army. There has been some controversy as to the level of Syrian approval of strikes. Syria maintains that it is a violation of its sovereignty, with President Assad stating recently in an interview with the BBC that the US is trampling over international law. The extent of coordination on airstrikes remains to be seen, but with Syrian warplanes sharing the skies with coalition aircraft, it seems an element of cooperation, most likely done by a third party, is present. The latest ISIS atrocity of burning a Jordanian pilot has reiterated the desire to degrade and destroy the Islamic State. Today we discuss how it is possible and what needs to be done in the war against ISIS. Joining us today will be Charles Shoebridge, former counter-terrorism officer, writer and broadcaster. But before we begin, let's take a quick look at this video report on the war on ISIS and the aftermath of the murder of the Jordanian pilot.
In the aftermath of the Islamic State burning Jordanian pilot Muazzez al-Qasabsi, there has been a general feeling that the world is united, at least politically, in fighting ISIS. The way in which the pilot was killed has appalled the Western world, with the jihadist group posting a high-definition special effects video showing the heinous crime in slow motion. The act itself incited waves of condemnation which reflected a disgusted global community. Prime Minister David Cameron stated that the sickening murder will only strengthen our resolve to defeat ISIS, whilst US President Barack Obama described the crime as further proof of the Islamic State's viciousness and barbarity, as statements of solidarity came in thick and fast from Amman, a staunch Western ally. For numerous days, the words "Jordan fights ISIS" ran smoothly in the media, with the Hashemite kingdom elevated to the very top of world affairs. Whilst there has been an increasing consensus that destroying the terror organization is now a crucial global priority, the stark reality is that the lack of true action has stalled the war on ISIS. Jordanian strikes in response to the execution have been symbolic and more media-orientated than effective on the ground, despite waves of F-16s bombing ISIS-held cities. Jordanian strikes in response to the execution have been symbolic and more media-orientated than effective on the ground, despite waves of F-16s bombing ISIS-held cities. This comes as ISIS is reported to have an influx of 20,000 foreign fighters in its ranks, with over 3,400 at the very least deemed to be from Western countries. And as ISIS consolidates its presence further in Syria, the powerhouses of the world look more stagnant in truly finding a solution to this unprecedented threat. Barack Obama's proposed framework for US-led war against the Islamic State is reportedly not just restricted to Syria and Iraq. And future plans to take the ISIS strategy into the next US president's term will see a more multidimensional attitude to fighting the extremist group.
Charles Shoebridge, thank you very much for joining us. In your opinion, the execution of the Jordanian pilot, in light of recent events, has it really changed anything fundamentally in the war on ISIS?
Fundamentally, no, it hasn't. What it has done is given the West media and certain aspects of Middle East media an opportunity to portray, obviously accurately, ISIS as a threat to the establishments in those countries, but also to the people themselves. And indeed, even in the West, ISIS was being portrayed in that way anyway. But of course, it's good to note, of course, and never to forget that for the first two, let's say, of the years of the Syrian conflict, what metamorphosed into ISIS was very much supported by the West. ISIS has been, of course, for not just the West, particularly Britain, France and the United States, but also countries in the Middle East region, Saudi Arabia, Qatar and others, to varying degrees, ISIS and similar actors have been useful foreign policy tools, not least in the destabilization of Syria and, of course, parts of Iraq. And in many ways, this is the source of what is quite accurately, therefore, called blowback that these countries are now experiencing.
I mean, Charles, this element of destabilization which has occurred, and in response there has been an international coalition to attack ISIS. I mean, we've had thousands of airstrikes all across Syria and Iraq. But at this current moment in time, is ISIS quelled? I mean, are they going back into their original areas? Are they retreating from Mosul, other places? Or is the war on ISIS stagnant?
Well, first of all, I think, as it's always often the case, it's useful to, let's say, identify our terminology. We're talking about here an anti-ISIS coalition that includes a number of states that have been, at the very least, very benevolent towards ISIS and similar groups over the last few years because it's suited their foreign policies.
Would you describe it as a kind of double standards policy?
Yes, very much so. I mean, we've got a situation where, for public consumption, there is an anti-ISIS alliance, supposedly, that, as I say, comprises countries that actually have done a lot to foster ISIS. And so, for example, their joining of airstrikes has been highly symbolic, to say the least. Let's take, for example, the case of the UAE, where the Americans only in the last few days announced that for over a month, actually UAE has not been taking part in these airstrikes at all. And so as well, it must be questioned the degree to which countries like Saudi Arabia are actually having any meaningful impact on the ground with these strikes, other than as PR for the US-led anti-ISIS alliance. And at the same time, it's very important to note that the main fighters on the ground against ISIS, particularly in Syria, that's to say the Kurds, of course, in their various guises, the Syrian army and Hezbollah, and of course further afield and in the wider context Iran, these actors, these very important actors on the ground, do not feature, formally at least, in America's anti-ISIS alliance whatsoever. So in short, you've got an anti-ISIS alliance that indeed, as Patrick Cockburn very succinctly put it recently, comprises of some countries that help foster ISIS, and but excludes the main people who are fighting it.
Yeah, because it was described as kind of aiding terrorism in some places and fighting terrorism in others. But Prime Minister David Cameron recently described how a disease of Islamic extremism will hang over my generation. Is this extremism homebred or foreign?
He's right to say that this is like a disease because of the functions that it carries out in terms of, for example, ruining to a large degree community cohesion at home, to actually as well causing a real terror threat on the basis that there will be blowback. And indeed, for example, in France, Belgium, and arguably also in Britain, we are seeing that blowback result in terms of actual terrorism in these countries that have sent jihadists off to fight in Syria and elsewhere. But of course, one has to question, as indeed your question does itself, the degree to which the West has created this problem in the first place. There's a long history going back even to the days of Bosnia, for example, to Libya, and of course very much the case in Syria, where the West has, if not actively sent jihadists and extremists to these countries to destabilize them in one way or another, has certainly tolerated the movement of jihadists from, for example, Britain, France and elsewhere, because it has aided their own foreign policies.
I mean, this issue of blowback, I mean, to what extent has UK policy actually aided directly or inadvertently the rise of jihadism in Syria? And we've seen numerous examples of aiding moderate rebels. I mean, has this actually in turn rebounded on the UK in such a fundamental way?
Well, the UK, for example, and we can take the UK as an example of a general wider Western situation. For example, with France, suffers very similar problems, and their reaction in terms of combating the threat belatedly has been similar to the UK as well. So the UK is, if you like, a good example of what's happening in the West generally. So, for example, for the first 2 years of the Syrian conflict, as the example, as we've said, it suited Western policy to have Syria destabilized. Therefore, I don't think it can be seen to be a coincidence that it's only really when ISIS and similar groups, particularly ISIS of course, to which the majority, arguably, of Westerners have gone to join, as opposed to more moderate rebel groups. It's only really when ISIS turned on the West and turned on the rebel groups that the West was more allied with in Syria, and also when ISIS started destabilizing in a very major way the West's ally Iraq, that actually then the UK, for example, started taking action to enforce the law that already existed, in fact since 2006, to stop people actually going to Syria to fight. I mean, and now we are seeing in the UK, for example, prosecutions almost on a weekly, if not daily basis of these jihadists.
And we've seen empirical examples of this form of prosecution occur all over Europe, but there is a particular piece of legislation which is kind of in the UK dealing with returning jihadists and jihadists wanting to go to Syria and other battlefields all across the Middle East. I mean, this legislation, if implemented, will it actually make a difference, or is the problem far more in-depth and far more deep-rooted, a grassroots problem, we could argue?
Well, you're right to say that the government has introduced more legislation, in fact quite controversial in many respects, and we can come on to that at a different time if you like. But the point is that they are reacting to this situation, the urge to, if you like, be seen to be doing something. The fact is that really since 2006 on the UK's statute book has been legislation which prevents or criminalises people going overseas to fight in terrorist activities, taking part in terrorist training and so on. And one can be, I think, reasonably sure that if people, jihadists, were going off to fight alongside Al-Qaeda or even the Taliban in Afghanistan against British troops, for example, those people would have been prosecuted. But because they've been fighting on the side of people arguably that Western foreign policy, particularly British and American and French foreign policy, has supported in places such as Syria and Libya, and perhaps further back in places such as Bosnia, there seems to have been a lack of political will to enforce existing legislation. And now it's only...
Is it because, however, these jihadists, when fighting in Syria, at different times throughout the crisis, because it is a crisis defined by milestones, is it that when they're allied with, or aligned, you could argue, with British policy, then there is no real desire to stigmatise these jihadists? It's only when they're not aligned with British policy and they actually make a threat towards the UK and other countries that they are actually described as terrorists, extremists. I mean, this Khorasan group we discussed, we've had discussed for numerous weeks and months now. I mean, is it just a figment of the imagination, or is there really a fundamental threat from jihadists in Syria who are British, who want to come and implement violence in this country?
I think there's no doubt that there is a section of those who have gone off to fight in Syria and elsewhere who, when they return, if they do return, and may return for this purpose, will carry out terrorist attacks, what we would call terrorist attacks, on home soil. That's especially the case, ironically some might argue, now that the UK, France and other countries from the West are actually attacking ISIS. So even if there was a threat beforehand, and undoubtedly there was of blowback, simply because the West being, if you like, generically an enemy of Islamist thought to that degree. The fact that we're now physically attacking them on the ground certainly makes the UK, France and even the US targets for these people. That isn't to say that all those who go off and fight in Syria will then come back to attack their home countries, but I think increasingly that's likely to be the case.
I mean, because we've had with recent reports of up to 20,000 foreign fighters within the ranks of ISIS. I mean, has this really killed any notion that there is a revolution in Syria?
Well, the question, of course, arises as to what degree there was a popular revolution in the first place. And even if it was popular, and of course there's a lot of evidence to show that there was a lot of support for that revolution or that uprising, the degree to which it was, as it was marketed almost invariably by the West governments and media, as a secular, democratic, liberal, as well as populist uprising against Assad. As we know, there's a lot of evidence to show that the driving force behind this revolution from the outset was one of more of Islamism, was of replacing Assad perhaps with someone who wasn't Alawite but was Sunni, and really pretty much was a reaction, should we say, against situation that it was in at the time in Syria. I mean, we can't beat about the bush. Assad was and is a dictator, but this is far from unusual in the Middle East region. And of course, many of those leaders that perhaps we don't call dictators, but we call kings or emirs or princes, they are supported by and support the West. So this idea that the West was pushing at you, if you like, for so many years, that this revolution was something that was really at its core to do with democracy, liberalism and secularism was, I think, misplaced, notwithstanding that undoubtedly there were Democrats within that process.
Do you consider the fact that the absence of secularism in Syria as a cause for its extremist cancer, which is suffering from now, or is the issue, the concept, the ideology of secularism a point which could be used for the future of Syria?
Well, there's no doubt that that sectarianism, if you like, which of course is the opposite of secularism in many ways, is the driving force behind many of those more extreme actors in the Syrian conflict. It shouldn't be forgotten, of course, that many fighting ISIS and fighting the rebels, in other words, many of those who are within Assad's army are themselves Sunni. It shouldn't be forgotten that, for example, Assad's wife is Sunni, indeed here from the UK. And so one has to consider those aspects, and not only that, the number of, for example, generals and officials who were said to have defected from Assad's ranks in the early days. These were generally Sunni, and of course, therefore, that begs the question, if there was sectarianism in Syria at the time, how did these Sunni rise to such high ranks in the first place? But of course, all that is now history. The fact is now that you have a really extremely sectarian organization in the form of ISIS, and to a lesser degree, but still sectarian, many of the rebel groupings within the general rebel alliance, and those are those including fighting ISIS because they attack ISIS.
If we were to quickly take this as a kind of proxy war situation, where you have this geopolitical hall of mirrors, these different sides, one would be the Iranians and the other would be the Saudi Arabians. I mean, if we were to take it as a sectarian war, taking into account the latest events in Yemen and Iraq and other countries, who is winning in Syria?
Well, it's a very good question. Certainly the Syrian people are still not winning, no matter whether they are Sunni or Shia, Alawite, Christian or whoever. You've got a situation where a war has been turned into a sectarian war. I mean, if one can discuss it even from the basics, that if you want to replace Assad simply because he's Alawite and because he's not Sunni, then of course that itself would be a sectarian consideration. But I think there was more to it than that. There was a general, as we saw with the Arab Spring generally, a revolt, a rebellion against authority generally and against economic circumstances and a whole range of complex issues. But certainly it's been in the interests of outside players, and let's look at the case of Saudi Arabia. Of course, Saudi Arabia has itself, and Qatar to some degree as well, promoted a sectarian form of Islam that, of course, largely declares war on not just non-Muslim faiths, but also, of course, those that aren't sufficiently Islamic as far as it sees it. And so, in many ways, it's the intervention of outside forces that has created this, if you like, sectarian schism. But it's also been an easy way, if you like, for the West commentators to characterize this war. It's a simplistic way of, if you like, describing this problem, especially in Syria, as saying it's simply Sunni versus Shia or other groups. Because as we've just mentioned, for example, with the makeup of the Syrian army itself, and indeed the makeup of many of Assad's supporters. These are Sunni too. And so it's a complex situation that can't easily be described, notwithstanding the attractions for Western commentators to some degree in sectarian terms.
There is a kind of a chaos of terminology when you discuss the Syria crisis. The narrative, it's quite hazy and misty at times, isn't it?
Yes, it is, because of course it plays into people's hands who've got interests in the situation. For example, we talked about the, let's say, the term moderate. Moderate is, of course, a relevant, not a relevant term, it's a highly relevant term, but it's a very relative term as well. And what we've seen is the West's media and the West governments, certainly until relatively recently, describing rebel groupings as moderate simply on the basis that they're not Al-Qaeda or ISIS. Whereas, of course, if these people were promoting what they're promoting in Syria, but in London, Washington or Paris, they would be called very far from moderate, particularly in relation to their views on democracy, women's rights, human rights, and the rights of other religions. But nonetheless, it's been in these countries' geopolitical interest to back such groups, simply because, of course, they are all united in really the one aim of toppling Assad. And that, of course, has been very much in the interests of players such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Israel, all of whom, of course, have very powerful lobbies and interests in the Western capitals.
Okay, Charles Shoebridge, former counter-terrorism officer, broadcaster and writer, thank you very much for being on the show.
It's a pleasure.
Moving on now, and the Syrian capital Damascus has witnessed a huge rise in shelling, with hundreds of mortars raining down on the capital over the previous weeks. In response, Syrian forces have attacked rebel strongholds in Douma and Jobar. The eastern Damascus countryside is held by militant groups under the branch of the Islamic Front, with their leader Zahran Alloush warning Damascus of hundreds of rockets yet to come. The rebel bombardment has left 5 dead and scores wounded, as life in the capital continued despite the threat from continuous mortars. Syrian warplanes targeted what they described as terrorist groups in the east, which has led to the death of dozens also. The bombardment of the capital has consisted of more than 100 rockets, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a pro-opposition group based in the UK. Meanwhile, in the south of Syria, pro-government forces have embarked on an offensive to oust rebel groups from their stronghold in Daraa, with the US sending warning over the impending attack. Syrian state television has said that the military gained control of the strategic town of Deir al-Adas and the village of Deir Makir, as well as the nearby area of Tel al-Arous and Tel al-Sarja. This area near the Jolan Heights had previously been controlled by the Al-Qaeda branch of Syria, al-Nusra Front. In addition, Western media reports suggested that Hezbollah commandos had participated in the major offensive, with rebel leaders warning of a guerrilla attack to come. As the dynamics of the Syria conflict continue to change, with the increase in the vast plethora of jihadist groups, more areas in the south are now becoming hubs of the violent jihadist group al-Nusra Front. The dangerous Al-Qaeda affiliate has also threatened the breakaway from Al-Qaeda Central, an issue which has long been seen in the making. Al-Nusra Front has adapted and altered its strategy. It has become more forceful, more potent, and is beginning to take a step out of ISIS's rulebook. For the major part of 3 years, Syria's Al-Qaeda branch has been known to work with moderate groups that they ideologically believe to be infidels, seculars, or apostates. All of this has changed, however, especially in the strategically important north of Syria, where al-Nusra is expanding and fighting other militant groups such as Al-Hazm and Harar al-Sham. It has enforced control over many villages and trade routes near the Turkish border, and has completely routed the US-backed groups in Idlib, which are now thought to only have 1 to 2% of the whole of Syria. But as we speak, al-Nusra Front seems to be engaged in an alliance with the so-called moderate groups in the south of Syria, with military operations very closely coordinated. To discuss this further, let me introduce Kevork Almasyan, a writer and political analyst. Kevork, the Syrian capital has been under bombardment continuously, but not in this way in volatility. Why the sudden change? Are the militants now stronger in Damascus?
No, I don't believe the militants are stronger if we compare their strength in the last couple of years. But the problem now that Zahran Alloush, the head of the Islam's army, he knew that the Syrian military strategy was to besiege the territories that was under his control. Therefore, many people who were living in Douma and other places that Zahran Alloush rules, they were frustrated and they wanted their basic needs. Therefore, and there was a lot of desertion among the Islam army itself. Some generals defected to Jabhat al-Nusra, others defected to ISIS. Therefore, Zahran al-Lush, by showering Damascus, the capital of Syria, he wanted to strengthen his position among his public base in Duma and also in other places. Zahran al-Lush now is in big trouble. His popular base is very weak. The many generals are defecting to other terrorist organizations. Therefore, by showering the capital and the retaliation that happened from the Syrian army side, he tried to foster his position again among his public base. But I believe he failed to do so because the majority of Duma residents who fled the area into Damascus, now they were also targets of Zahran al-Lush missiles. Therefore, the anger and the frustration raised against Zahran al-Lush and not vice versa.
I mean, with Syrian raids on Duma, there has been a kind of rebound effect, but we could argue, I mean, is it just a misconception that the Islamist fighters are stronger and are better equipped? I mean, why are these moderate rebels defecting to all the ISIS groups, the al-Nusra groups? Is it because they are better equipped, better armed, because they have better principles? Or is it just because the extremists bring more fear into the hearts of their opposition?
It's about victory, Mr. Danny. I believe the only terrorist organization now who is able to achieve some kind of victories against their opponents is ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra. These people have very strong ideology. This is the first thing. The second, they are in control of several oil and gas pipelines. Therefore, they can finance themselves. And three, they have many private donors across the world. Many people are donating and supporting, including governments and non-governmental actors, these terrorist organizations in Syria, because they are able to fight and to continue their fight against the Syrian army because they have a strong ideology. That's why many people want to defect this failed terrorist organization, let's say, from Islam's army, the Free Syrian Army, and they join Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS because they need money, finance, and second, they need a moral victory, which is by achieving some sort of territorial gains in Syria.
Because this changing dynamics that you have, I mean, this element of Islamism, this ideology within the opposition ranks, does it make them a more militarily cohesive unit in general?
I didn't get your answer. I didn't get your question, Danny. Can you repeat it, please?
This presence of the Islamism, the ideology within opposition ranks, does it make them more of a cohesive military organization? Is brigades?
Exactly. Exactly, Danny. Look, when the first Turkey and other neighboring countries tried to organize the armed opposition against the Syrian government, they relied on the so-called Free Syrian Army. But then they understood that this army, the so-called Free Syrian Army, without a strong ideology which can make a balance of terror against the Syrian government, it would not be successful. Therefore, they injected this Islamist Salafist ideology into the ranks of the opposition fighters, including fighters from Chechnya and other places.
Yeah, I mean, the foreign fighter element is very well documented, but the Syrian army is now reported to be on a major offensive in the south of Syria, near the Golan Heights and near Dar'a. What can you tell us about this? Is there really a big major offensive taking place in the south of Syria?
Yes, there is a big major offensive against the suburbs of Dar'a. There are multiple reasons for that, and there are also the participation of Hezbollah and also Iranian generals in this war against Dar'a. We have to understand that the situation in South Syria is much more complicated than the northern side, because in the southern side, the rebels, the opposition fighters are united in one way or another, and they are united under the banner of the finance and the training of the Americans inside the Jordanian territories. And since the Israelis intervened directly to assassinate the Hezbollah generals in Nigeria, and then by coordinating with Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS on the borders with Syria, it was the right time to crush this wall It's like the Berlin Wall that was separating Damascus from its southern side of the Syrian Arab Republic. And we have to know that the Israelis and the Americans were preparing for a ground offensive on Damascus through Daraa. Daraa was the only way possible for the Americans to be able to put pressure on the Syrian government by their proxies, who were Free Syrian Army and the Nusra Front in the southern side of Syria.
Speaking of Al Nusra Front, I mean, there are very big reports now that Al Nusra Front, which is the Syrian branch of Al Qaeda, is set to be defecting from Al Qaeda, the mothership, if you'd like. So there is going to be apparently this form of defection from the Syrian branch. And the Zawahiri mother branch. I mean, what can you tell us about this? This has been very well documented. Is this going to happen? And what effect will it have if it does?
Everything is possible now. Look, even ISIS was part of the Zawahiri's branch, and then they defected. And now Al-Nusra Front. It all depends on politics and also the power game in Syria. But at the end of the day, whether they defected or not, this is not the issue. Whether they alleged their for the leader for Zawahiri or not. This is not it's not about individuals. It's about ideology. Now the only truth in Syria is that you have a very strong Salafism, Islamism, or the militant Islam. This is on one camp, and the other camp is the Syrian army and its supporters and their allies underground in Syria. So whether they defected or not, they will continue and they will generate other leaderships, just like Osama bin Laden when he died. Al-Qaeda didn't finish. So the same thing for the so-called caliph, if he is dead or not, this is not the issue. Our problem and our fight against terrorism is about ideology and the fight of mind. It's not only about the fight of weapons and ammunition. So therefore,
last question. The concept that we have now, Al-Nusra Front being more rogue, more potent, more violent, it seems as if this group, which is the Al-Qaeda branch, officially in Syria, is now taking a step out of ISIS's rulebook. To what extent do you see Al-Nusra Front now in Syria, with the latest developments in Daraa, actually taking a more openly jihadist stance like ISIS? Are they the new ISIS?
Actually, Jabhat al-Nusra was the most violent group in Syria before the creation of ISIS. We all know that their ideology is also the new Wahhabism. It's similar to ISIS. There is only very few minor differences between ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, and it's only about politics. And when Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS fought against each other, they didn't fight for ideological reasons. They fought because there were differences on who will control where and who will control the oil fields. Therefore, Jabhat al-Nusra it should be on the top of the list beside ISIS, and in my opinion there is no difference between them. But the current fight in the south of Syria, and namely in Daraa, I believe, in my opinion, that the Americans are now trying to promote Jabhat al-Nusra as the moderate faction because it's the strongest army after ISIS, and it's less radical, let's say, in very few grades from ISIS. But at the end, in my opinion, there is no difference between ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra.
Kevo Kalmassian, writer and political analyst, joined us over the phone from Beirut. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you, sir.
Now, peace talks in Moscow have ended without much change, as Staffan de Mistura, the UN peace envoy to Syria, met President Assad to discuss his proposal for reducing the violence, starting with a hostilities freeze in the northern city of Aleppo. In October, de Mistura put forward an action plan for Syria proposing to freeze fighting in local areas to allow for aid deliveries and to lay the groundwork for peace talks. To discuss this further, let me introduce Alia Mahfouz Ali from Tartus, Syria. She's a professor assistant and political activist. Alia, thanks for joining us. As you know, the Moscow talks ended recently. Did they have a positive effect on efforts for a political solution in Syria?
Well, thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
Well, generally negotiations are sort of steam releaser that can relatively calm down the raging people since they pave the way for ideas to be afloat. Regarding the war in Syria, we've witnessed many talks and negotiations like Geneva I and Geneva II. Moscow talks differ in a way that Russia announced that these talks will be a step further for a Syrian dialogue without an international influence. Plus, Moscow talks categorize the opposition figures into those who believe in a Syrian solution, like pure Syrian solutions, and others who are tied to international and regional policies. But after all, any kind of negotiations will be successful if it's held in Damascus. And I believe the Moscow talks, the positive effect of Moscow talks, that it's the first step towards Damascus.
Now, we've had other attempts at a political solution twice in Geneva and recently in Moscow, but there has always been the problem that the parts of the opposition in Syria are actually unable to prevent the entrance of arms. They're unable to control the jihadist groups on the ground. So, as with the Syrian government, I mean, we've had allegations leveled that the Syrian government does not want to end the war. It wants a military solution. I mean, in order to really find a genuine solution, what is needed now?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you well, but...
I mean, to find the political solution now in Syria, what is needed to solve the Syria crisis now?
What is needed to solve the Syrian crisis now? Well, the problem we have here is that the opposition armed groups activated on the ground do not really follow any political, let's say, political group, say the coalition or the coordination body or whatsoever. So the problem is that whatever solution or resolution we had in a talk or something could not really be applied on the ground. From one part, like the government can apply their resolution. Like if you can remember, throughout these 4 years, there's been many treaties and reconciliations where, like the army, since they have a leadership, they can cease fire immediately and instantly. But who can really oblige the armed groups to do so?
I mean,
is it the coalition or any? Or
Alia, exactly on your point. I mean, we've had areas in Damascus such as Berzeh, Ma'addamiyya, areas such as Qudsiya. These places have witnessed national reconciliation without external forces, without external parties. I mean, is this type of national reconciliation a blueprint for potential solution to the crisis from a military perspective?
I'm sorry, what about these areas in Damascus?
Is it a blueprint for a potential solution in the Syria crisis?
Well, any area in Syria should have sort of a reconciliation with whether it's forced, like in army victory or in army advances, or in sort of a reconciliation, social reconciliation, like what we had in Ma'addamiyya, for example, or most parts of Hamas, for example.
I mean, because it's essentially speaking, we're discussing the issue of de Mistura's visit to Syria. He met President Assad, and they agreed to meet again, of course, and on a political solution. But the issue of Aleppo and freezing violence within the city, I mean, can this really go forward without being hindered by external factors and parties?
Well, the Mistura plan would be a breakthrough if the recent UN resolution is in action. Like, the resolution 2199 that to crack down financing terrorist groups throughout illicit oil fields, sales, trading in antiquities, and paying ransom for hostages. But who would really apply such a resolution? Would it be just another ring in the chain of other resolutions that have been issued throughout all this war? So that's the question. Such a resolution was really applied with an international intention to stop this war. This thing will be a breakthrough. The freezing in Aleppo or any other part of Syria.
I mean, how do you see the Syria crisis now? I mean, where is the next step? What is the next path to peace? I mean, is it, for example, stopping the entrance of arms to rebel groups, stopping their funding and finance? What is the major step to take now to really find a genuine solution?
What is the main step? Where are we heading or
Yeah,
something?
where are we heading? What is the next step?
Well, the problem is now, like every day is like a new day. Like what's happening now in the south was not really expected. The whole frontier, the southern frontier, just went off, really crazy. And the advances there are really remarkable. And what's happening in Damascus countryside and in Aleppo countryside are really noticeable. So, but with the UN resolution and with what happened really in the Western countries, what they witnessed from the previously backed armed groups, like namely ISIS or Mistura or something, what they witnessed from terrorist attacks and something, this was like a wake-up call for their governments and for their people to stop funding or to stop promoting them as like Che Guevara's or something.
Moderate groups, yeah.
So what's really happening now is not unpredictable. Like you cannot really predict what's happening. But I think we've reached a critical point where anything can really happen. Like maybe the war will end, or maybe a bigger war will be triggered in the region.
I mean, Alia, one question which is of great interest, and I would like to ask you is, can the Western nations defeat ISIS within Syria and Iraq without finding a political solution to the conflict in Syria?
Well, things got mixed up really in Syria with the political solution and the armed solution. So ISIS or any other kind of radical group is basically really tied up to political parts and political groups. So what happens now, like if the U.S. or Western governments, they say like we're going to fight terrorism and we're going to send moderate rebels some weapons or diplomatic aid or something. But what happens really is that we do not have moderate rebels, which means like any weapon they send or any aid U.S. sends, it falls in the hands of in the wrong hands of the radicals. So if really U.S. and the Western governments have the tendency to fight terrorism and to have a political solution in Syria, they have to stop really aiding ISIS directly or indirectly. So there is no political solution without the real fighting of terrorism. And the real fighting of terrorism is like by stop funding them, stop promoting them, and stop sending them any sort of aid.
Alia Mahfouz Ali, Professor Assistant and Political Activist, joined us from Tartus in Syria. Thank you very much for being on the show. A big thank you to all of my guests as well. Charles Shoebridge, former counterterrorism officer, writer and broadcaster. Kevok Elmasian, a writer and political analyst. Thank you very much. For more updates, please visit levant.tv. Thanks for watching Syria Talks. Until next time.